All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So I think we're going to mainly be focusing on chapters 10, if there's any remaining questions, and then chapter 11. We already, here in the room, quickly went around, and we're all, well, Ruben just finished chapter 11. Jorge and I are both on chapter 11 right now. Fernando, are you also chapter 11 at the moment? Yeah.
Yeah, chapter 11.
Okay. Sounds good. So I had so Ramiro has an event that he had to go to tonight. There's a chance he might pop in later because it's in Durham if he gets out of it. But primarily we will be relying on Jedi Master Jared. So I had a question that goes back to chapter 10. Do other people have questions before chapter 11? No? Maybe we start with a pretty basic thing that I just realized it's still confusing me. So if you look at listing 10.41, this is just one of many examples of where this kind of structure would come up. Oops, hold on, I have to switch over. So the thing that I realized is that I'm still, that's 10.42. I'm still getting a little bit confused in the thinking about how the methods as defined in Rails relate. I think it's two different questions. Keeping track of how the methods as defined in Rails relate to the CRUD, or if we want to describe it as the CRUD actions, or to the RESTful principles.
Okay.
So for instance, here in listing 10.41, so we've the methods that are defined are new, create, and edit. So I guess first question, is there a one-to-one relationship those methods to, I guess it's not create. I mean, create is create, I suppose, if you're thinking CRUD, create, read, update, destroy. But new, so yeah, how does that? So new is also part of the. I'll just go ahead and put the other part of my question out there. The thing that confuses me is it's a little confusing to me the fact that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it's sufficient to just have the method defined and for the method not to have anything in it whatsoever. Like there's no code that goes in the body of the method. Sometimes we'll just be like, oh, we need to make sure we have an edit method, and I'm not sure why that is. I can't remember if this is an example of one where we then later add more code to it. I think we do later add more code, at least to the edit method here.
Okay. So, this is my best answer to this. I mean, obviously the methods that you have to have defined are the ones that we already listed up above in the routes.rb, right? So in listing 10.37, I guess it shows that we're creating this password resets resource. And then we're saying the only methods that exist are this new, create, edit, update. Nothing else.
Yep.
It's using the resources behavior so that you get stuff automatically, and I think that's part of where some of this magic comes from as well, of the mappings, is through this resources, and then the only is just restricting it, saying these are the only ones that exist. So I haven't yet reached that in mind, but let's do this stuff up over here.
Just switch over to your screen.
You can if you want. Let me zoom in on this. It's a little small. I'm gonna make this larger. Why can I not?
Well, you're doing that, so I guess part of it is probably answered by going and always reminding myself of this type of chart we have with the HTTP requests,
Right.
and what each of these actions correspond to in terms of HTTP requests.
Yeah.
And I guess the answer to so basically anything that's I guess this won't always be the case, but when the new action would be, seems like it would often be a method where maybe all we need is to have def new end, because all it needs to do is provide a view for something, right? But without that action defined in the controller, the fact that there's a route is insufficient, right? Does that sound right?
Sorry, I missed that. Explain it again.
So if we didn't have the new action defined in the controller, the fact that it is up here in the routes would not be, the fact that it is up here in the routes wouldn't allow you wouldn't be able to get to the or you at least wouldn't be able to point to the new. I guess you could go to it by typing in the exact URL, but you would not be able to send somebody there using like from other points in your program.
I mean, you still could potentially, but
Like
it would
if you
just
just list out the URL.
Yeah, it'd be more awkward. But even then, having the new mapped is mapping back to what happens when they navigate to that. So I've got, not quite as far, but I need to remind myself, because I don't write in Rails all the time, as I've used the rake routes quite consistently to remind me of the mappings between stuff. And I'll go look, like, what do we have for the news that we've used before? So we had sign up. So for the sign up page, a GET request would be go to users new. And that makes sense. You're creating or trying to create a new user there. And then we also have the same mapping down here with the URI users new that you can go to. So basically what that's doing, it's not mapping as directly as you might think to a CRUD in terms of like just create, read, update, delete. It's not necessarily mapping to CRUD at that point, because you're not taking an action.
Right.
You're just getting the data for something.
Right.
So it's not a CRUD action changing anything.
Right.
It's just returning the first instance of or information for that using these GET actions.
Right.
Whereas the create is the CRUD action actually creating something on the back end. So this new is essentially just returning you, okay, we don't have something yet. There's not actually a resource mapped to this on the back end to go get yet. So give me a page that will, represent creating a new resource type page, right, is what's being used. So the same thing applies on what you were talking about over here for the passwords reset, right? It's got the new is essentially saying, give me a new password reset page. They haven't created something with it yet, but give me a page that will map to this new. It's sort of just a get, but not mapped to an actual instance of any data on the back end. Right. And then the create is what's actually going to map it back to a resource in password resets controller. I believe that's not using a model, right? That's another one that's using, correct, just the controller and storing its information in the user model for anything that it needs to store. So when it's creating the this doesn't map to its own model. It puts some values on the user, but that's the actual. It's a little strange because of the way that he's using these, in the sense that you don't have a separate password reset model that you're creating an instance of. Right. Instead, he's mapping it back to the user and creating password reset properties on the user. Right. So it's a little bit different than a straight up CRUD concept, I guess. Right. But
yeah, I guess the way I would think about it then is that in the controller, we're building out the logic of our program, right? At least some of the logic. I mean, certain aspects of logic might go in the model, but and that kind of explains why something like the new method, a new action, might not have any additional logic to it. There's some logic in when you show it, but that shows up often actually as you can see here, actually in the in render new and within the create method, like when you're gonna shoot somebody back to that again, right?
Right.
Yeah. Somehow it's just it's. Sometimes it feels like we're saying the same thing in multiple places, but we're not really.
There's a little bit of that, and part of what's going on here also is the Rails magic, where the application controller, which we can look at this stuff again. That we've all done many times.
Controllers always make that new edit.
The application controller is inheriting from the action controller base,
mm-hmm.
and the action controller base is part of this Rails underlying bit that's saying, oh, I see that a new was called on this controller, render a view that maps to it, right?
Right.
And so by defining that new on that controller, then when somebody makes that GET request that hits that new, it's going to render the matching view for them by default. And so it's the Rails magic. By just declaring that new, it's making sure that it's rendering the correct view for you.
Right.
With that, because otherwise, if you try to make that request, it's not going to be able to render that correct view and map it correctly when it tries to call new against that. Right. I don't know if they exactly answered what you were looking for, but
yeah. So I think my other question was about was in chapter 10 was so I ran into this this problem that I was eventually able to fix as usual just by Googling, and in this particular case, we have this great crutch that reinforces how valuable Googling can be. That you just throw in the word Hartl, and you'll almost always find someone who had like the exact same issue you had. So my problem was I got to the end of chapter 10, and everything was working perfectly. So all my tests were green. And everything, and then when I actually would use my app in development, everything was working great. And then so in chapter 10, we'd worked on account activation and password reset. But one thing that's tricky is that, at least the way we had it set up in development, they weren't actually sending any emails or anything. And so I guess, as is often the case, there may be some slight differences between your production environment and your development environment. And in this case, one of the differences is that they weren't actually sending those emails, so you weren't actually having to, the way he handles it, you go back through your log, right? If you wanted to click to see what to click on, actually the only way to even see the URL for that was being generated for the view of the actual password reset or the actual page where you would where it would tell you that you successfully activated your account, was by going back through your Rails server log. So you'd scroll back up. I don't know if you guys did that, but then so anyway, I did that also in development, and it all worked. Then as soon as I pushed it all up to Heroku, I was like, okay, well, I want to make sure that everything is working on my app in Heroku, and everything seemed to be working okay. But then when I would go to create a new user and activate it, it would generate the email correctly and send it, now sending to my real Gmail account, and I'd click on the link and nothing would happen, and it would also, and then it wouldn't let me. It would also, and so I thought maybe the view was messed up, but it was actually activating. In reality, I went back and checked in the app, and it was getting an error message that the user hasn't been activated.
That sounds like similar to what I have, right?
Sounds very similar to what you had, sort of, but
It's different. Yeah. Well, in my case, I had already made a user before we implemented the email.
Oh, right.
So when I was going back trying to log into that user, I wasn't getting anything back when I was clicking login because the account wasn't activated, and I couldn't send the email again because the user was already in the system. So
I had that problem too. So Cruz and we went through it. I spent a long time trying to. It's a little harder to reset. The commands are different to versus to reset a Heroku Postgres database. So I was trying to look that up. In the end, I just went through. Cruz reminded me that you can actually go in and do run Heroku, the Heroku console, and so I just went back in and deleted, cherry-picked which users I wanted to delete, because I was working on this problem for a couple hours this afternoon, where I was like, wait, now I've used all 3 emails that I have access to right now, and none of them have successfully activated. But so in the end, that's not the point of the story. So the problem was I did this dumb thing where I didn't go. Part of the code he has you do when you set up what's it called? Something grid. The program that I actually used to generate the emails. I didn't actually change he had some template URL in there that I forgot to go back in and change. But so I fixed that and it works. But so my question is, so Is it common then that the tests, in this case, it seems like our tests skip over anything that's for production only? And my question is there generally, can we change that? Is there a way to test our production environment while in our development environment? Or how do people deal with that if there are differences? Or do you just try to minimize the differences between development and production?
That's a really good question. That's a pain point in software development. There's a lot of ways that people, a lot of different approaches to try and work around that and try and make that work. That includes minimizing the differences, but sometimes you're going to have differences. It includes sometimes you can run your local system like it's production. So sometimes you can do what would be a production build and just run that on your system. Now, this is an example of something that may not work there though, because the send grid, maybe you have to have that set to a specific URL, and so it's going to be hard to configure it and have it work on a developer's system and test against it. That might be a good example of one that you couldn't just do a production build on your local system and test it. It's also a bigger challenge when you're working with a tool like Heroku. So traditional software development, right? A traditional application, you control all of your backend, you decide your database, you set it up, you hook it in, etc. But when you've got these platforms, as a service type things like Heroku that let you just deploy your app of different types onto it and do a lot of that configuration for you, then it's a little harder for you to run a mirror of production on your local system. So some of the different ways that people test stuff like that is a little bit like this. You might have a stub. You might have mocking things that are supposed to be similar but not the same. Knowing that you're going to have to test something else. Sometimes those just fall into, especially when you're on a bigger software development project, that's the type of stuff that the quality assurance team will do for you, where you say, all right, here's the stuff that we can't test in development, so let's set up a process to test that in production. And that might be manual testing, but they may write testing of a whole different level to test it in production. So it's also possible, the other approach, and that's what I was getting at with the last one, is you can write a whole different set of tests that you might run against production that aren't running directly in your app the same way most of these Rails tests run.
Right. And part of the reason for that, right, is because, at least in Rails and presumably in other systems as well, I mean, by definition or the way it's set up, there isn't a separate, like in development, there's a separate test database and everything, right? So there's a whole,
right.
It's all built for that, whereas production, there isn't, right? I mean, without having that setup, if we ran tests in production without creating that setup, we would be modifying our production environment in the process of running the tests, right?
Yeah, there's different ways to work with that too. You can do things like take a snapshot of your database in production and then either run through your tests and restore back to the snapshot, although if other people are working with it live, well, they may have made changes in between there. Yeah. So it might be more typical to take a snapshot and then test against your snapshot so that you're not testing against anything live and you're not blocking people from making updates to live data. Right. Some databases may support, this is something I've been looking for actually, so I hope some of them have this, but the concept of sort of like ghost or temp records, I don't even know how to describe this, but the concept of essentially like you've got your live database behind it, right, and then you've got sort of like a fake layer in front that you make changes to but don't actually write back to the live database. And then when you read sort of sequentially going back. So that might be another way to do some of that type of testing. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, and that's why you'll see things where, like I say, people write tests that don't live in the same environment. It's not like it's running Rails test or Rake test the same way. It's a whole separate test tool. Things like that might be Selenium's a popular one, which is a web browser automation tool. So you can write tests in a lot of different languages to interact with web browsers, and that might be the way that somebody would test something like that if they really want to. Is write some Selenium tests that they run after they've pushed to production. Also common is you don't push directly to production. It's like a tiered infrastructure, so you've got your development environment, and then you usually have, especially on large things, like a QA environment, and then maybe even another stage after that. So QA is going to be even closer to production in terms of what it has. It may have, its own mock data, or you may even have, like, at my job right now, we've got like QA, and we have something called like alpha, which every couple months we snapshot the database from production and mirror it over to alpha, so that you have an environment where you can work with data that is relatively recent and correct, and then test against that. So it's sort of a tiered structure to do your testing. Well,
okay. That makes sense. Yeah, primarily I wanted to just make sure I wasn't missing something, like, wait, is there something that I had missed or should have done in setting up testing, or something he could have done differently, but not. It sounds like there are much more fundamental questions and ways of dealing with it, but there's no like easy way in Rails to set up testing.
I would have to look more into what Rails supports. I'm sure that there's some support for some of that type of stuff, but I don't. Right, it would be.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions about that? The other just kind of basic question, maybe Jared, after I ask, maybe we can switch to your screen and actually look at it. Maybe I'll switch to, I'll show my screen for a second, and then was how to just trying to again get like a refresher to understand. So this is my app right now. I think Ramiro went over. Sorry, I don't know what is he gonna do. Oops. Hold on. Apologies. This is what happens when you try to share a screen that is not actually visible to you. Okay, crap. Where is it all? Help. Did anyone see what I did?
What are you trying to share?
Is this?
Oh, it's weird.
It is still working, right?
Hold on. Let me see.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah, I'm seeing your.
Another. Can you still hear us? We've temporarily, by we I mean me, temporarily screwed up the system.
Went down the rabbit hole. Yeah, you've got multiple desktops now on a different one.
What do you see?
I see his. Is that you? Yeah.
What do you see?
I see your Cloud9.
I see his. That you?
I see your Cloud9.
I see his.
Okay, wait, now can you mute yours?
You?
Who's live?
I see
Okay. Another, shake your head if you can hear us. Yes? No? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry about that. That was my fault.
I do have like a lot of errors though. I fixed one error on my app, but that was when I finished chapter 10, and I fixed one error, but then I have like 6 more errors.
Oh, really? Like when you mean in your tests?
Yeah, it's on my test. It has to do with the resets. Sending the email, I think it was, which I think this is the one you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, we were talking about that just a moment ago.
All the errors relate to that?
I have like, let me see. Hmm. When I do. Yeah, I have like 4 errors and 2 failures.
Do you want to, I mean, we can take a few minutes and if you want to share your screen, we can try to look at them and see if
Yeah,
we.
I can. Let me see.
The screen sharing should be the green icon. Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, it's going up.
Yeah, you said, yeah, 3 failures right here and 5 errors. And let's see. One of them, this one I did not understand what he meant. Oh, I guess he's just asking for like, I don't know, -1. I don't know. I don't understand this one right here. But the other errors, I think is just a typo somewhere in my application.
Well, yeah. Let's start with the failures. I'm assuming it's always good to go sequentially through these things, but maybe not.
A lot of times it can be, yeah.
Test current user.
Test current user returns right user when session is no. All right, that's in the sessions helper.
Returns from user.
And when did
Maybe something with this fixtures.
this? Let me see if that exists in mine already. Is that the sessions controller test or sessions helper test?
Session helper.
All right.
Helper session helper. Yeah.
Current user returns right user when session is no. All right, yeah, I already have that. Cert equal user current user. Cert is logged in. Okay.
See,
So
my,
jump over to your user's controller.
I think it might be because
Jump over to your user's controller. I had a similar error at the end of chapter 9 that had me for a while, so I'm checking to see if it's similar to mine.
okay, let me see. Files and files.
It is interesting. I mean, I guess when I get this type of error, yeah, I tend to start by looking. First, I glance at my test to make sure I didn't screw up the test, and then I.
Stay at the very top there of it.
You said to the user's controller?
Yeah. Okay, that all looks.
I think it has to do somewhere like around here, maybe.
Well, let's see here. Let's look at the error again.
Which one you want to look at?
Let's start with the first one, but let's look at several of them because they may help tip us off. They might all be related. Okay, your bash is just up there, actually. Okay. So your assert equal is failing in there, right?
Just undefined method number 2. Update attributes.
So, can we leave that up for a minute?
Go back to the error.
Yeah. I want to look at that and then some of the other ones. Okay.
It might be directly to the.
Let's look at
test
some of the other errors right below it. So let's look at 2. Users controller test.
On the update attributes, this one's, I think there's 2 errors on that one with the update attribute.
Undefined method update attributes for nil class. So test should redirect update when logged in as wrong user. Logged in as wrong user. Okay.
When did the error happen? Like when?
You said
What was
these,
the last thing he did that happened?
yeah, you said these occurred at the end of chapter 10 for you?
What was that?
These started happening at the end of chapter 10?
Yeah, like at the end of chapter 10. Like the last section of chapter 10. That's when they all started getting all the errors.
Okay.
And then I went back on chapter 10 just to see if I had like all the correct like syntax on the files, and it all seemed okay.
Password reset. The last one, and then the email.
But then I tried looking it up or looking this on Stack Overflow. Like somebody had this same error with the update attribute, and what they did, they deleted one. Let me see. They deleted like a current user method from my helper sessions.
Yeah, the session's over.
Yeah, like right here, that they deleted one of these. I just don't know which one. And then I removed this one, but it gave me like another error. So then I just left this one there. This one right here. I deleted that one.
Not setting the at user to anything if he goes out.
Where?
So the update method in the users controller.
Go to your users controller.
Back to our users controller.
And if he goes to update,
Let's look at your update. That's what I was
yeah,
wondering too.
see where it says if at user.update attributes. Well, at user needs to equal to user.find params.
All right, Ramiro, don't tell us the answer. Ramiro's here now too, but just how smart we are.
Yeah, you are missing. Yeah, there you go. Good eye. He's not actually setting a user variable in the update. So whenever it tries to run through that update, there's not the at user is going to be nil because you didn't actually grab a user.
Okay, where are we at again, you said?
Inside your update method.
He doesn't.
2 methods down from create, where you're at right now.
Update.
Update. Yep. You see where you've got the line if @user update attributes.
Uh-huh.
The problem is you never actually set a user parameter, and so you never assign that @user. So when it checks for if @user dot update attributes, @user is nil. It doesn't exist. So you need a line before that to set the @user.
Right here on the bottom.
No, before at the very top of that. Before
Right
I don't have it.
inside of the def update, but right before the if. Yeah, a lot like that line right up there in the create, except it'll read a little different. Because unlike creating one, you're just finding one out of the database.
Okay. Let me see.
I guess.
I tried to I just shared what, the formatting gets a little weird.
Yeah, if you looked at my screen, I got it up on mine too.
So the thing I'm not doing is, you said I'm not setting the user right to the update attributes params thing.
Well, you're not actually getting a user before you try and call update attributes on the user. You don't have a user to call it on.
Oh,
So
that's right. Yeah. Update. Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm just saying like if @user. Okay. So yeah. Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Well,
you actually have to fetch your user to perform your actions on them.
yeah. Okay.
Maybe we got rid of that later.
I think we're doing it. I think we do. Okay, yeah. I think we, yeah, 'cause I remember seeing that, but I remember taking it off.
What don't
It
you
might
have?
be right. I don't have that. No, but he's ahead of me. He has it. I don't have that. Mine it works fine.
Hmm.
I don't think he needs it, but there is an error somewhere there for his.
He shouldn't need it for
Yeah.
that operation because he's performing an update. He needs to be able to get the
Yeah.
user that he's going to perform the update on.
Right. If because if you haven't loaded the user, then @user is going to be nil, and nil doesn't have the method update attributes.
Yeah.
All his tests turn green now,
Yeah, I can,
just because of that.
let's see. Go back and look at him. Are your tests passing?
Oh, okay. I saw green, so I thought that was his. So it's Dan's.
Dan.
I don't think that's.
Huh.
I don't think that's the only error
Oh yeah, there might be others.
because.
The other one passed though, right?
No, these errors are totally different now. Now
Okay.
we're-
So yeah, I fixed the update attributes one, but now I have more.
Yeah. Well, if you want, we can continue working through these.
Does anybody else have any more questions? Because I do have another question though. On what's more like a understanding a little bit more on the fixtures files. So that's just for testing purposes. But
Yeah.
also, like, I guess just having things more neat in a way, or I guess that makes sense. I like
Sure.
organizing stuff.
But yeah, I think what you mean is that you're separating concerns, right? You're separating your test code because you don't want to put a lot of your test, like the data for your tests.
Yeah.
You want to do it with your test code. So I think that's what you mean. I don't know if that's what you meant by by making it neat.
Mm-hmm.
Where we would call that, I guess the technical term for that would be separation of concerns.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you.
Yeah. Yes, I get what you're saying. That's not where I was going with it. I was like, wait a minute. That makes.
I can scoot on down.
All right.
We got a famous person in our midst.
Yeah. Now we have the full council of Tar Heel,
Famous people.
including the Tar Heel of the week. No offense to any Wolf Packers, but plenty of offense to Blue Devils. Did you have more questions about?
Yeah, everything's fine.
Was that what you were asking about with that? Was why we separate out the fixtures into their own file that way?
Yeah. Well, I guess it makes sense. I mean, since we're using what our fixtures file is just for testing purposes, right?
Right. It's because we were talking earlier about test databases and how do you test on production and the challenges with that. And so even in your development environment, you don't want your tests, your unit tests, to be changing your database, because if they're changing your actual database, even for your development environment, then every time you go in to do development, you're going to have to either reset them, or you're going to have to change them, or you're not going to know what the state is. And so that by using the fixtures and approaches like that, you're essentially bootstrapping your own little environment to do testing with, that is only there for the testing and then disappears when you're done testing.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I just wanted just to clarify a little bit more and see if I was like in the right path about fixtures. So that's good.
Right. Yeah, another way to think about it is also, it's a way to, Ramiro nailed it, separation of concern. It's a way to have a set of data that you know should be correct for the app, and then you can use that same set of data throughout all your tests in different places, and know that way you don't have to recreate that data in each one of those places, or update multiple places to make sure that it matches what your data should be. You have the one sort of canonical set of data, and everything else can load it.
Wow.
Okay. Yep. I guess I was on the right path.
Okay. Did you have another question?
Not for right now.
Okay. I had one. I actually had a fairly basic question that might go along well with that one, about tests and not about the test data, but about just formulating the tests from chapter 11. Let me see if we can share my screen and not screw things up this time.
You can go over to mine if you want.
Okay, yeah, actually, yeah, let's just go to Jared's screen. And so if you look at listing 11.6, I believe.
Right.
So this is, I like this one as something to ask about, because these are really about as simple as you can get when it comes to the tests, right? This is not one where we've done anything particularly complicated at all. So my questions were, so we have a setup which does kind of get back to the fixtures question, but I'll put that aside for now. So we're loading some data in to use for our tests, and then the very first test should be valid. So valid is a built-in Rails method, correct? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And I take it from the fact that from his explanation, that this test is read, that the default, if you have it established validation, is that the test, the method .valid will return false if there hasn't been any validation done. Is that correct?
Well, so the way the valid method works is that it's actually an active record method, and so you have your model which extends from active record base,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're in that model you define a whole bunch of validations,
Mm-hmm.
and then this valid question mark method runs through the list of validations that you've defined, and then it either returns true if all the validations pass, or it returns false if at least one of them fails.
But it seems like, I guess my question is, if I remember correctly, at this point, when we first do it, we haven't established any validations, and it seemed that it surprised me a little that it basically seems like it returns false if you have no validations.
So let's look like which I go down a little bit.
I think right here we already have
Okay, yeah, so
the validation.
yeah,
just
that's a
above.
validation. So validates user ID presence true. That means that we've defined that you are required to have a user ID.
Sorry, can you scroll down again?
Well, it
Right, yeah, it's
so then when we do micropose.valid, and right now it's nil, right? So then we don't, then user ID, the way the validation works is that if it's nil, it says, okay, it's not there. So the validation would fail. Because we've defined at the top that user ID has to be present. And if user ID is not present, then that means that the value is nil of that attribute. Because when you create a new instance of the micropost, all of the attributes are going to be nil initially, right?
right.
And so that's what it means for them to not be present, essentially, that they're nil, that all of them are nil. And so you're requiring user ID to not be nil. It has to have some value.
Right.
That's the validation. And because you're setting user ID to nil,
But aren't we only setting user ID to nil for the test user ID should be present?
Yeah. Which one? So you're saying they were red here, right?
No, they're not both red. That's the point is that should be valid. I thought he explains it somewhere right around there. I thought should be valid is green at this point, and user ID should be present is red because we haven't yet set up the validation that the user ID needs to be present. If you scroll, sorry, I should look at it on my screen as well. If you scroll, it's either, I think it's just below it or just above it.
Just below it, he had validation for length on the content, and then it says it should be passing. Maybe it was,
Yeah, I mean, sorry, he actually explains, he says, this one is green and this one is red, this is why.
maybe it was right above all of this. Maybe it was listed 11.2.
Oh yeah, I suppose it's possible, sorry, it could be that I've misled you as to which listing. Yeah, that could be the source of all the confusion.
Yeah. I think it was 11.2 because then in 11.4 he adds the validation to make 11.2 pass, I believe.
okay, so he first,
Yeah.
yeah, like that's there I guess the way you would do it is you would create a test,
Right.
and it fails, and then you add validation, and then
Right.
it passes.
Right. But that,
And yeah, so I guess, sorry, so apologies for pointing us to the wrong listing, but so looking at listing 11.2, at this point, should be, no, okay, now actually what you're saying, it's making sense now, because it's the other way around. Should be valid is green, because we haven't set up any validity that fails,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
and user ID should be present is red because we haven't like weeded that out.
Right, yeah. So micropose.valid is going to return true when it shouldn't be valid.
Right. Okay. Sorry about that. That makes sense. Then my other going back to 11.6. The last two tests. I guess it just always strikes me like these types of tests always strike me as like, oh, I wouldn't have thought to just, they seem like almost like too simple because they're examples of where we're just choosing one particular thing that I guess in both cases that should fail, and then we're because we want passing to come out as true, we're saying assert not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after having passed something that should fail.
Well, assert not, you're expecting that expression to be false.
Right.
Yeah, it's a little weird when you read it, right? Because false is true, sort of, right? Assert not takes a false argument and returns true, and when taking a true argument returns false.
Yeah.
It's essentially what it does.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And so,
Or true
so that
falsity.
so that was part of my question is we're basically just using assert and assert not where in order to make sure that it always that because true is always going to be passing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're using them based on how we get true to be the passing result, right?
Yeah, I think that's, we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, yes. The only difference is the assert statement. It's not just like this function returning true or whatever. The assert is assert is like the magic bit that Rails is checking for in the tests. So by saying assert not, it's a little more than just bringing back true, I guess, off of a false. It's making sure that assertion is run and part of your assertion, like set of assertion tests, right?
Right.
So putting like true in place of it doesn't do the exact same thing because it didn't run it through the assert function. It didn't assert that something occurred.
Yeah.
Right. But then, so my more fundamental question was just, so I mean, basically, are these good tests? Should we think about should we often think about writing tests like this where we are basically just coming up with one thing, one example of how it could be working incorrectly and testing to make sure that thing doesn't get past our test? I assume the answer is yes, it's perfectly fine to do this, to just leave your testing at this, unless you can think of other common ways that might get, other common things that can get past your, that you don't want to get past, right?
Right. So I think the question is, are these tests too simple, or would you need more complicated tests?
Yeah, basically, are they too simple?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think they are very simple because we're not, like, the application is not really complicated. It's not too complex. So he doesn't really have any other way to show us how to do testing, I guess. I mean, the ones before, when we were working on the account activation, the login, and all that was a little bit more complex.
Right.
And then for this, we can probably discuss this, me and Jared, because I don't know, sometimes I think that these tests, like if you write a more complicated application, they're not necessarily that important. I mean, they're kind of good, but they're not as important as other tests. So if you had to pick and choose which tests you want, because you should assume, in a way, that the validation mechanism that Rails gives you is correct, because they're supposed to be writing the test cases. I mean, obviously that can fail, but
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, this ends up being more of a test of whether you may have thought that you implemented that you wrote the validation method correctly, and maybe you just accidentally wrote it gibberish or something, right?
Right. Or like let's say that you change the validation to something else.
Right.
And not thinking that it's going to affect something else, then this would catch it. But I mean, the validation is so straightforward. Like when you read it, so straightforward that okay, validate presence of user ID. That it's kind of hard to get it wrong in a way. But I don't know. What do you think? Because
Yeah, my opinions are all over the place on testing right now because I've been doing, I mean, I've done a little bit of it, but the app I'm building right now is the first time I've been doing extensive testing, trying to write stuff out. And I do think it can be, sometimes you can over-test the things that should be just obvious or shouldn't be broken, And some of that comes down to your philosophy of why you're writing tests in the first place. And I find that I've encountered several different philosophies. Some people's philosophy is the testing is to make sure that the complex bits of the app work together the way I expect, that the things that are going to be hard to trace are the way I expect. And that's sort of like Ramiro saying, well, we don't really need to test something that should work. That's just this one line of code. We need to test these other, more hairy bits that are complex and tricky, and they're more likely to break. So people's philosophy tends that you want to test down at this level, almost as a, and this happens a lot in languages like Ruby or JavaScript. You want to test at this level almost as a documentation, almost as a either documentation of this is how this stuff is supposed to work, so that if somebody else goes and tries to change something, they're going to fail a test and realize, oh, this was intentional.
Right.
Or also because these languages are dynamically typed and don't do a lot of checking at compile time that everything is exactly what you would expect, you end up with some people who really like these types of tests as sort of a replacement for some of that as well, where it's verifying a whole bunch of aspects of your data at this low level as opposed to a language that might check that for you. I tend more towards liking the higher level or the more integration, end-to-end stuff is seeing a lot of value in those. These can have value, especially on edge cases that you're prone to fail on or that you might make a mistake with, but for ones that are very straightforward, I'd be like Ramiro, I'm like probably not going to write this because I feel like I'm just testing the Rails function almost directly. There's just a little bit of testing of making sure that I wrote it.
I guess one of my questions with these last two tests in particular is, I don't know what the rest of you guys think, but I would have, as somebody who's just starting with this, my temptation would have been, oh, I need to write out instead of choosing one particular case that fails, like the case of a post that has 141 characters. Oh, I need to write a test that checks that it has 140 or less characters. So my temptation would have been that it needs to have an actual greater than, less than, so and somehow try to encapsulate the whole realm of failing. It's more like directly testing the exact proposition. But that may actually be worse. I don't know. I'm not sure.
So you're thinking about testing anything that's all the things that are larger than 141 characters?
Yeah, I mean, I would have been tempted to write something like test content should be at most 140 characters. Then I'd be okay. Now I have to think okay. I guess the problem is you have to feed it data.
Yeah. So you would have to test 141, 142, 143.
Right. Yeah. That makes, yeah, I guess I can't think of a way that I would formulate it differently.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing with it is, like even the creator of Rails, David, DHH.
I always do that too.
He wrote this post about how he used to be like testing every little thing, because that's like a lot of people are like really hardcore about that, and then he felt bad whenever he didn't meet those expectations of testing every little bit. And he's like, yeah, at the end of the day, like what you want to test is like the very high level stuff. So then I don't think he covers this. Well, yeah, he covers some of it, but the integration tests, right, where the user goes and fills out this form and sees this other form, like that's testing like a whole bunch of things with your application. I think those are the more important tests. Like if you rush and you only have a limited amount of time, like those are the tests that you really need to spend a lot of time in working, because those are the tests that are going to show you when something breaks.
Right. And I mean, I share a very similar opinion. Like I say, we're going down to a very granular level in the app we're building, because some of the other developers really like that. And to me, I understand it to some extent, but it also produces another problem of its own sometimes, because if you try and extensively test everything down in every little function, then one of the arguments for doing extensive testing is it makes refactoring safer because you know that stuff works. But on the flip side, and this is what I've encountered, we're doing a lot of refactoring, and it also makes refactoring harder because you have to rewrite all of those low-level tests, and you can't just rely on a high-level test that was testing the workflow that would still pass, because, oh no, these dozen low-level tests all broke as well because I changed the structure of some of this stuff. And so sometimes they become very fragile in that respect as well when you're testing at that low level, because every refactor will have to go rewrite all these tests, even though what the user cares about or what we care about from the end product, none of that changed. Right.
Yeah. Does everybody understand what refactoring is?
I didn't until the other day when Cruz reminded me. Sorry, I realized I don't know if we even had. Did other people have specific questions on Chapter 11 right now?
Chapter 11.
The other general question that maybe we could also talk about another time was looking back at. Let me see if I can succeed at sharing my screen without screwing things up. And I'm about to do the same thing I did before, where I can't see the what do we need, the window, just the app, or not the sorry, the code.
There's two Fernandos.
Just the code. Just a quick refresher on the front end. Ramiro did either last class or the class before did a nice overview of the structure in terms of looking first at the kind of, you've got the style sheets, and then you've got the individual views. One of my questions was just, so in this particular app, we haven't done anything really. If you look at our, like the coffee files and all the JavaScript files, we don't touch those really, except I believe application.js is where we go through and require Bootstrap, for instance, and a few other things. Right. So yeah, right there. So yeah. So I was wondering when, like, just a big picture question, like when would we go into these files? And one thing that I haven't understood is I hear people talking a lot about using some JavaScript in a Rails app and how that works, maybe particularly as opposed to this idea of using Rails for your backend versus and then having a JavaScript like Angular front end. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so like everything that we've done up to this point is all the work is done by the server, right? Like, well, we've only coded Ruby code that does something, but our browser is like a smart device, right? Like it can do computations and calculations and everything else, and the browser itself has language JavaScript that you can use. So if you could, instead of doing all the work on the server, if you could do some work on the browser, and then the browser sends you the work that it's done, then that's really good because then your server is not as overloaded. And you can satisfy more users. It also might look a little bit more responsive because if instead of loading the entire page every time somebody submits something, you only like modify what should change, then the experience for the user looks more responsive, right? And so those are like the benefits of using JavaScript with the browser. And so that's when you would start adding JavaScript here or doing some JavaScript and using a JavaScript framework. So here you would probably add, well, there you already have a JavaScript framework. jQuery is a JavaScript framework. And you would do some JavaScript here that then can communicate with the server using Ajax. I mean, Ajax is just like loading a page, but instead of the browser re-rendering the page on the user's screen, it just loads data from the backend, and then it can either decide to update something on that page, or it can decide to do nothing, depending on what you coded to do.
Right. A good example in this of when you might want to use JavaScript for this exact type of app might be, for example, of course I'm not running right now, am I? All right, fine. Let me fire up my server real fast. All right. No, not running yet. All right. A good example would be this form here. Would be a very prime example. I keep having that show up in my code all over the place. Gotta get rid of it. I keep forgetting. I've got like an extra open angle bracket that I put somewhere, and apparently it's a habit of mine because it's ended up on multiple pages of mine. I just keep, like, I do a page and I'm like,
Maybe it's in the header.
it's in the first tiny bit of the RB right at the top. Every time I seem to do double angle brackets.
Okay.
I don't know why. Here's a great example though. We've got validation on this right now where we don't really validate the name, but we validate email, right? And we validate the password. But we can't validate that. Let me validate the password.
Basically, if we used foo, the fact that we can't actually validate until we hit the button.
Yeah, you can't validate until you hit the button. And what that does is it goes back to the server, sends that form information back, and then has to come back with the updated information to tell you that something's changed. Whereas if you use jQuery, for example, now this gets redundant when you're doing it this way, but you have to do it that way. You could write some jQuery code that monitors when you type stuff into the password field or when you've changed over to the confirmation field. and performs the same validation that you're doing on the back end, except to do it within the browser, and tell the user, oh, this isn't a valid password right then. So that's a great example where you could mix the two, where Rails is still doing a lot of the work, still generating the pages. You still have to validate on the back end. You'd never let jQuery do the validation by itself, because then somebody could not use the browser or bypass the jQuery validation and send invalid information back. But you'd be doing it to make it a more responsive experience for the user.
Yeah, and you would write that in that JavaScript. Well, you probably wouldn't write an application.js, but in one of those files.
Oh, okay. So you would, but if you were using JavaScript for your entire front end, you wouldn't. That doesn't mean you would do it in those files, though, right?
So there's a few levels. There's
I thought some people would.
right. You're thinking of
An API.
right. You're thinking like that's what Jorge did with his project of the Iron Yard.
Right.
Is that your application could be an entirely JavaScript application. And that's it, and then it uses an API to do the work. So then in that case, you would have like another Git repository where you have that JavaScript application, and then you would just have to talk to the other developer that's developing maybe the Rails application. Maybe it's a Rails application, or maybe it's something else like a C# application, and you guys have to communicate about what the API is going to be.
What are the, like when deciding from the outset which option is the best option for a particular app? What do you consider?
Oh, well, that's easy. I mean, there's huge debates in the community on that.
Yeah.
So there's not a set, this is the best answer.
Because the problem is that there's trade-offs and pluses and minuses to each way you go. Like if you go with they're separate, completely separate, then it's nice. The nice things is that they're clean. Like the workflow that you're doing for one application, like you're following what that community has set out, and then the Rails application, you're following what that community has set out. If you do them kind of like together, like the two communities haven't really thought about how to work together, so you're gonna be kind of making it fit, like slamming it in there. And I mean, you can do it, but then you also run the problem of not creating a nice API, a nice looking API, because you have the Angular app right there, and you're like, oh, I can just do this and change it, and so you don't have a nice API. Like, so then, if you want to do it in something else, then it's more difficult. So in a nutshell, there's like trade-offs, pluses and minuses, and you really have to probably sit down and analyze it with your whole team. It's like, okay, what do we all want to do, and what are we comfortable with, all of us?
Yeah, I mean, there's not one answer. There's certain types of applications that I would say you pretty much have to be done with some sort of front-end JavaScript framework, because if you need a lot of interactivity, if like something like Google Docs, where you're writing all of this stuff and you're moving stuff around, these very complex applications that are very interactive, that mostly has to be something happening in your browser, because trying to go back to the server to get that stuff, and I'm not saying all the data's in the browser, but with that API layer, right, where the interaction, what is changing on the screen, a lot of that has to happen in your browser, because otherwise it's just not going to be responsive. But for just about everything else, which is the vast majority of applications that are out there, you can go anywhere on the spectrum, from everything generated on the server, the way we've been doing it, to a mix of the server doing some stuff with some JavaScript enhancements, with like jQuery, to the strict separation between them. And that's a place where there's just so many opinions on what the best approach is.
And I assume this is probably a really dumb question, but I assume so. There's no because so wait, jQuery is also a framework.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, maybe it's not a dumb. I don't understand then how. So how do you take advantage of jQuery in a Rails app?
So the Rails is just putting a little snippet of code in your layout that tells the browser to load jQuery. And so then you have jQuery available in your browser, and then other code that you also going to put in your header, not your header, in your layout. Then that piece of code tells the browser to load your code, and then both jQuery and your code are loaded into the browser, and then that's how that's how it works.
Yeah, part of what's confusing to me is when I think about the framework, like when I think of Rails as a framework, I think of one pretty big part of it being a structure that we interact with, whereas I wouldn't be able to at least visibly see any jQuery structure that I was interacting with.
Right.
It's like a file structure.
Right. And so I guess, yeah, the problem is also because we're working with Rails, and Rails is very structured. Like it wants you to put files in certain places and all of that.
Right.
But that's not common to all frameworks.
Right.
Some frameworks are more like, oh, you can put stuff wherever you want, and you can do things however you like. And so jQuery is more towards that end, and then there's other frameworks that are more structured. And so we're seeing kind of the extreme with Rails, where it's very structured, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
Right. And jQuery, compared to a lot of, I was going to play around and try and do something, but I was going to do something like flash the color over the header. jQuery, unlike a lot of JavaScript frameworks, also is, so it's I don't want to say it's unique, but it's been around a long time, and so it has a little bit of a different concept, because a lot of the new JavaScript frameworks act a little bit like Rails, where they own stuff. There's a specific structure that they expect, and stuff works a certain way. jQuery works a little differently, where it doesn't really tell you how to put together your HTML and how to generate it. Instead, pretty much all jQuery does is give you a set of tools to manipulate your HTML when you already have it on the page and change it there. So instead of doing a lot of the drawing yourself or stuff like that, it's sort of like looking at what you have on the page and then manipulating it, which makes it very, very loose and can just be sort of injected in pieces anywhere. It's like, oh, just grab this and attach something to it, or grab this thing and change something.
Right.
A lot of the other JavaScript frameworks are much more controlling, or like, this is my piece, I control what's in it, or I expect certain properties on it. Right, so that's what makes jQuery so easy to mix in with just about anything, because it doesn't need to control much. It can just...
Yeah, and if you were to look at, for example, jQuery, and then you look at Angular, even though they're both frameworks, you would see that they're very, very different from each other. They do things very, very differently.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. All right. Fernando, any other questions on your end? Are you good? Yeah, you're muted.
I think he has one. He typed
I
in.
think, yeah, you can unmute him.
I was talking, sorry, with me. No, other the one I was thinking about using jQuery on the sign up page. Well, I guess that would be more JavaScript. I was thinking about when we do on blur and then for like checking the password validation instead of like going and hit like the submit button and then going back. Is that what you would use on Blur, or like what would be the best thing for that?
So there's, yeah, an unblur means that when you take out the cursor out of that text field, that's what unblur means. And the other one is unfocus, is when cursor enters that field. So I mean, I would use unchange for that one, because as you're typing, you want to be able to check that the two passwords are the same. So if you think about it, if you did unblur, then somehow the user would have to take out the cursor from there in order for that check to happen. So if they click on the submit button, that's one way that the cursor goes away from there.
But if you just hit enter, it would never go away.
Right. Yeah.
It would be instantaneous with yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, in this case, I would do it with unchange on both fields, right? So one unchange, and then the other unchange, and both call the same function, same JavaScript function.
Okay, yeah, I was just being curious about that.
Okay. All right. Well, we're a little over time already, so yeah, I think that's just. I mean, again, just curious how things fit together, but that's helpful. And so for next class, hopefully we're aiming to all be done with chapter 11 if we can. I know it's going to be tough for me, but I'm going to make an effort at it. And then also next class, I'm going to try to share some of the ideas that have been proposed for apps for you guys to work on as first projects as well. So hopefully that should be interesting. Get a little bit of feedback from you guys on this. Sound good? All right. Thank you guys.
Yeah.